Okay, so here we are, chapter 3, social transitions. And in this chapter, you will definitely notice, more so than even some of the other chapters, that there are large sections that we are not going to be covering today in this video lecture. Part of it is that some of them are very American focused, particularly thinking about the American legal system and things like how they determine who gets tried as an adult, and also some of the terminology around some other offenses. And so I just don't feel like that's the best use of our time. It's definitely stuff we can talk about when we meet in class. And again, as I've said before, you're still responsible for reading the whole chapter. But again, the pieces that I'm not covering in the video lecture, I would say read, but don't obsess over. And hopefully by now that makes sense to you. So in thinking about social transitions, and again, it's weird because here I am lecturing to Ian and to a video camera as opposed to speaking to all of you actually. But I want you to just stop for a moment and just think about who you were as a child. Think about what type of kid you were, what things you liked, what type of clothing you wore, if you were allowed to choose your own clothing. Like, did your parents choose everything for you? Did you live in hand-me-downs from an older sibling or an older cousin? Think about the activities that you enjoyed, right? Think about sort of who you were as a kid. And now think about who you are as an adult, who you are today in terms of what activities you enjoy, your clothing preferences, maybe hair and makeup preferences, the type of people who you like to spend time with. And I'm going to guess that there are some pretty big differences. There are probably some things that have stayed consistent, but there are probably also quite a few things that are quite different from what you liked and who you were as a child to who you are now as an adult. But now let's also think of that in-between period. Let's think about adolescence. And it's in adolescence who we pretty much redefine who we are. We kind of in some ways define who we are. And society also changes how it sees us, right? We give children a pretty wide berth. Children are not encouraged, but they're allowed to ask questions that we would not allow or expect other adults to ask, at least not in public. We allow children to engage in behavior that we wouldn't allow. And again, allow is, I'm not saying like we give permission, but we kind of have that sort of wider berth. I think about things like some of the behavior we see from children in restaurants that we wouldn't accept from an adolescent or an adult. Even not in restaurants. I know at home, my daughter sometimes she'll get out of her seat to go pick something up that fell on the floor, and then she'll decide to become the family dog for a few minutes. She'll stay under the table, she'll bark a few times, she'll come over to get a pet, and then she'll go back to her seat and resume eating. That's actually fairly normal for children. I'm not just saying that because my kid does it. I'm saying it because like kids do stuff like that. But could you imagine a 15-year-old doing that? Or could you now, as an adult, imagine sitting at dinner with, your romantic partner and they dropped something and they dropped their napkin, let's say, and they went down to pick it up, and next thing you knew, you heard barking from under the table, but you don't have a dog? It'd be weird, right? So how society sees us and what society allows us to do changes in adolescence and into adulthood. And so in this chapter, we're really going to think about those social changes that happen, both how we see ourselves and how we fit into places, and then also how society changes its views of us as an adolescent. Or adolescent and into adulthood, I should say. So, one of the things that is happening, it's not a seems to be happening, that is happening, is that in our society today, we have this elongation of adolescence going on. Generally, people agree that adolescence begins with puberty, but when it ends is subject to debate. And this is a really interesting thing to think about, right? So we know adolescence starts when we start puberty. That's generally what we accept. We also sometimes just arbitrarily go with, okay, 13, teenagers, adolescents, boom, right? And we call sort of 10, 11, and 12-year-olds preteens or tweens. And we kind of leave it at that. But when does it end? Right? So like 50, 60 years ago, you ask that question, people would almost universally say at 18. Because at 18, you graduated high school, you got a job, you got married, you bought a house, or you joined the military, and boom, you were an adult. How many people get married at 18 today? How many people who get married at 18 today have full-time jobs and can afford to buy a house, right? Or live fully independently? So we're sort of getting into, and now, depending on where you live, at 18 you can vote, but you might not be able to drink, right? So in Ontario, drinking age is 19. In the United States, it's 21. In the United States, you can join the military at 18. You can vote, drive a car, you could run for public office, but you cannot buy a beer, which is kind of crazy. But that's a whole other story. There's a whole political thing behind that. So again, when does it end? Is it when you reach the age of majority? Is it when you become a parent? Then what of 14-year-olds who become parents? Is it when you move out of your parents' house? Is it when you finish your education? Right? And so just to share on a personal level, right? I grew up in Quebec, so age of majority was 18, okay? But at 18, was I really an adult so I could vote and I could drink? But was I really an adult? Because I wasn't a parent, I still lived in my parents' house, and I was nowhere near finishing my education. So, okay, parenthood. Well, I didn't become a parent until my late 30s. So does that mean that up until that point I wasn't an adult? And what of people who never have children? Are they not adults? Well, that might not be a great defining characteristic. Moving out of parents' house. Well, what we're seeing happening now is sometimes people move out and then they boomerang right back in because they can't afford to continue living outside of their parents' house. Or you have people like me who, I went to graduate school in the United States, and so I was in the US on a student visa, which meant my permanent residence still had to be in Canada. So technically, my home address, even when I lived in Arizona, my home address was in Quebec. So technically, I still lived at my parents' house. So it wouldn't have been until I graduated and got my first job and bought my own home that I would have been considered an adult if we looked at moving out of my parents' house, because up until I bought my house in New York, I was still, my permanent address was my parents' house. So I was 28 at that point, 21 when I moved out to go to school, 28 when I was done with school, and then finishing one's education. Well, again, I didn't get my PhD until I got my PhD at 28, which does feel like that was an accomplishment in and of itself. But does that mean for all those years I wasn't an adult? In some ways I didn't feel like one, right? Because I still got my summers off, I got a nice break at winter break, I had reading week in the spring. I had responsibilities, but not the same level of responsibilities that somebody in the workplace and somebody who had a mortgage would have. So was I an adult? But then at the same time, I was doing clinical work, working with people who were suicidal. I was the person who was partially deciding if they needed to be hospitalized. I was trying to encourage them to not commit suicide. So that felt pretty adult, but yet at the same time, technically, I still lived in my parents' house, and technically, I hadn't finished my education. So you can see how it gets murky to determine when adolescence ends and adulthood begins, okay? So there's this idea that adolescence begins in biology. So again, that notion that adolescence begins with puberty, and it ends in culture. So this idea that the culture that we live in, the culture that we're a part of, is going to be part of what determines when we reach adulthood, okay? What we're also going to talk about in a few minutes is this idea of emerging adulthood, which is prolonging adolescence in a way, but with additional rights and responsibilities. And I think there's some merit to exploring that term. I know that some people do not like it, but we'll see what you think. So, one of the things that the book talks about and that I wanted to spend a couple minutes on is this idea that adolescence is a social invention. And you might be thinking like, okay, Carrie, wait a sec. People have always turned 13 and then always turned 20, right? So again, we think of those teen years as the adolescence period often. So that has always happened. How is it a social invention? How is it that we created this idea of adolescence? Well, the thing is, prior to the 19th century, so that's the 1800s, the term adolescence was not used. Okay? You had youth and you had adults. You had children and you had grown-ups. There was no in-between. And part of that was because society was largely agrarian at that point, so largely people lived and worked the land. And as children were born into families, they were essentially groomed to help out. So particularly for females, they would help with child rearing, so with taking care of younger siblings, and they would also learn to help around the house with cleaning and with cooking. And boys would go out to the field to work with their father and potentially grandfather and uncles and siblings and all that as well. So there was just sort of this, like, as you grew up, you started taking on more and more responsibility, either outside on the farm or in the house or helping with childcare. And so then you got married and you were suddenly an adult having babies of your own. And that was kind of the way it was. And then the Industrial Revolution came along, and suddenly there weren't enough jobs for adolescents anymore. Because as people moved off of farms into urban areas and as jobs started taking place in manufacturing, there were also machines, so they didn't need as many hands on deck to do the work, and of course the work was going to adults. And so that's when education became more important. So a lot of people, prior to the 1800s, education beyond a cursory amount of education was reserved for the wealthy. But after the Industrial Revolution, education became more accessible, mostly for boys, not so much for girls at that point, but for higher grades, and then also doing things like apprenticeships, right? So learning a trade, not just working in manufacturing, let's say, or on the farm. And of course, as I mentioned, girls probably, they weren't going to school as much. So the impact of industrialization was, again, this is where I really need to look at the slides before I keep talking, fewer jobs, moving away from an agrarian society, and increased schooling. And thus, adolescents were born. Because now we had people who weren't quite adults, but not quite children. And we had to carve out a new role for them. And so that's what we mean by adolescence as a social invention. And so now here's the concept that I introduced just a few minutes ago, this idea of emerging adulthood. And the question is it a new stage of life or is it a luxury of the middle class? And so the group of people who we typically consider emerging adults are you, most of you at least, 18 to 25-year-olds, okay? And it's predominantly found in affluent Western countries, this idea of emerging adulthood. And this is because between the ages of 18 and 25, a lot of young adults are pursuing higher education, like all of you, currently pursuing post-secondary degrees, sometimes going on to graduate school, sometimes doing internships, right? So learning about what type of work you want to do, pursuing higher education. So again, you're in that place where most of you, if not all of you, probably have part-time jobs. Some of you may even have full-time jobs and you're doing your education, bit by bit. But are those jobs your careers? Is that where you plan on being? For a lot of you, the answer is probably no, right? So in this period of emerging adulthood, you're also figuring out what you do and don't want to do. So this is, I think, something we're going to spend some time on discussion on. I'm really curious what your thoughts are about it. because I know for me, again, as someone older and someone who has basically spent their entire life in school, from when I started nursery school at the age of 3 to today, standing here recording this lecture, I have never not been in school. I function on a school year calendar, so the fact that it's January and the calendar just turned really means nothing to me because we're mid-year. But I went right through my undergrad, my graduate educations, my year-long internship for psychology was on a university campus while I was also still enrolled in my doctoral program. And then as soon as I finished my PhD, I moved into an academic position and have been teaching at the university level since then. So I've never not been in school. And to me, what I've seen over the years, I think this makes a lot of sense, this concept of emerging adulthood. But I also recognize that I typically interact with 18 to 25-year-olds who are pursuing post-secondary education. Is it a luxury of the middle class, right? That's the question. So I'll look forward to when we actually can meet up in person, well, live, not in person per se, and chat a little bit more about this. So let's talk a little bit about this process of social redefinition, okay? There are some formal rites of passage, but most of them today tend to be of a religious nature or a cultural or even just symbolic. And so not everybody experiences them. So certainly things like for people who identify as Latinx at 15, the girls might have a quinceanera. Certainly for Jewish people at age 12 or 13, they may have a bar or bat mitzvah. And I can tell you, having grown up Jewish and gone to more than my fair share of bar and bat mitzvahs, you're not an adult, right? So like I had my bat mitzvah I was actually 11, not quite 12, it was just before I turned 12. There was nothing that suddenly made me an adult about it, and there was nothing about the ceremony that made me an adult. What it did was it gave me different rights and responsibilities within my religion, but it did nothing for me on the outside world, right? And same thing, I think about my brother at 13 having his bar mitzvah, and I look sometimes at the pictures and there he is in his suit and tie and like looking all, like he couldn't wait to get out of that and throw on sweatpants, right? Like as soon as we got home from synagogue, he's like, right? It didn't change anything. He wasn't suddenly pulled from school and sent out into the workplace. He wasn't expected to start pitching in financially in the home. And he certainly wasn't expected to take a wife right away. Again, so we have these rites of passage that also, we keep it at the age that it was that maybe made sense 4,000 years ago, but that was also when people only lived until their mid-30s, maybe early 40s. I don't know that it makes sense to tell a 13-year-old boy he's a man, right? Because he's not. He's an adolescent. So a lot of the things that we have that we experience in our culture, other sort of rites of passage that we think of are getting a learner's permit, which can happen at like 15 or 16, depending on the jurisdiction you're in. But what about people who live in like urban areas that don't drive, or people who don't have access to vehicles? I know growing up in Montreal, I had several friends who were just like, I don't have a learner's permit. I'm not getting a driver's license because I don't need a car. Why do I need to drive? I can get everywhere by transit. So, and I know in Calgary, some people have that same experience. So does that mean you're not an adult because you didn't go get a learner's permit? What if you couldn't afford the fee to get a learner's permit? What if you can't afford the fee to have a driver's license, right? So some of the things that we use in our culture, sort of our overall society, are still not quite those same rites of passage. So let's think about some of these common practices in the process of social redefinition. One of the things that happens is some real or symbolic separation from parents. So we discussed earlier that some of the conflict between adolescents and parents might serve a bit of an evolutionary basis or come from an evolutionary basis that then, the parents have confidence that the child can live independently. So what we also see happening is some of this separation from parents as part of social redefinition. It could be things like going to boarding school or going to an overnight summer camp, or more often for people today, it's going away to college. Now, of course, here at MRU, a lot of students are living in Calgary, and many are still living with their family of origin. I did the same thing. I went to school in Montreal and I lived at home through my undergrad. But there was still starting to be some of that separation. It wasn't quite like high school where, my parents knew what time school started every day. They knew the bell times. They knew what time school ended. Here it was like some semesters I didn't have school on Mondays. Some semesters I didn't have school on Fridays. Sometimes I had only one class a day. Sometimes I had 3 classes in a day. So I was starting to sort of be like, listen, I'm going to go to school when I have class, and I'll go to the library sometimes or go hang out with friends or be home, but it's not going to be like high school where I should be home at X time every day. It's going to vary. That was a little bit of how that separation starts. Other things like traveling. Remember a time when we could travel? Traveling without parents. So traveling either with friends or possibly with extended family members, but without parents. So starting to spread our wings a little bit. That's what really starts to happen. And that's part of how we discover who we are. We start to try on different personalities, different things, figure out what's important to us, not just what's important to our parents. In the process of social redefinition, we also see an emphasis on differences between the sexes, okay? So what we see happening here is that males in adolescence are given way more freedoms than girls. The thing that always irritates me, and I'm going to use it as an example anyway, is sort of this idea that in adolescence, it's okay for adolescent males to be sexually promiscuous, but it's totally not okay for adolescent females to be promiscuous. So my question is, who are the adolescent males supposed to be having sex with? Right? So like we encourage adolescent males, go out and sow your wild oats. You have, go out and have some fun while you're young because one day you'll settle down and oh boy, then your life is over. But who are they having sex with if we're telling the girls, thou shalt not have sex until you're married? Is there like one designated girl in each class who's like the class whore who has to serve us all the boys? So one girl? Like, no, of course not. But we don't want to think that our pure, nice adolescent girls are having sex. So either the adolescent girls are having sex with the adolescent boys, or the boys are having sex with older women, in which case, depending on how old they are, that's statutory rape. So that's not really comfortable either. But we tend to give boys that wider berth than we give girls. We also have different expectations in terms of education and employment, right? So if an adolescent male today looked at his parents and said, I want to go to university, but I think after I get my degree and I meet someone and have kids, I just want to be a stay-at-home dad. How do you think that would go over? Right. But yet if a girl did the same thing, people probably wouldn't bat an eye, right? That's okay. So we still expect males to be more ambitious, to pursue more competitive jobs. And yeah, we're okay if women want to do it, but we still kind of want them to be stay-at-home moms, right? And I know certainly for myself, raising a girl has brought all this up. And I actually asked my daughter this past week, I said, are you okay with mommy working? Would you prefer that I stayed at home? She's like, no, I think it's good that you work. And I was like, okay, good. Because I love working. I love what I do. I worked really hard and stayed in school for a really long time to get here. I have no plans of not doing it. But at the same time, I was just curious what her take was, because I'd like to think that she's growing up in a time where we're encouraging girls to pursue all the things that we're encouraging boys to do. But I know that there's still more of an emphasis on, well, it's okay if you don't want to do that because you want to be a stay-at-home mom, which again is totally okay. I don't want to disparage stay-at-home moms. I just want to know why as a society we aren't as happy to embrace stay-at-home dads, right? Okay. And then passing on information from the older generation. So as I was preparing this lecture and thinking about this and thinking about how in our culture, in our sort of general North American, Western society culture, we don't have a whole lot of formal ways in which the older generations pass down information. I know, I'm guessing, I shouldn't say I know, but I'm going to guess that many of you, like me as an adolescent, if your grandparents wanted to sit down and tell you about how things were, you were like, this isn't still the olden days, Grandpa, right? Like, kind of like, enough. I don't need to hear all these stories. But think about what happened when you finally moved from the kids' table to the grown-up table at big family gatherings, right? Because there's that moment where that happens, where at one point we're at the kids' table, and then we move up. And the conversations are different. And so we are still starting to get some of that information from the older generation in the sense of what are the different things that are being talked about at the grown-up table that are different than what's talked about at the kids' table? What are the conversations that, or the information that our parents don't shield us from anymore? I know certainly this week there's been a lot of political strife in the world. And at one point I was turning the television on and it was on a news channel and I just told my daughter, I said, yeah, I don't want you to see this. And I quickly switched it to something else. She doesn't need to know about what's going on in the world and scary things like that. But at what age were you included in that? Where your parents stopped shielding you from the news, right? At what age were you brought into conversations about sort of bigger picture things? At what age were you aware that maybe your family or someone in your family was struggling health-wise or financially or emotionally, right? Those are things we often don't tell children. But as adolescents, we start to learn about that. At some point, we also start learning about sex and intimacy. And those are conversations we typically have more with adolescents than with young children. Things about learning how to be an adult. Learning about how to balance a checkbook. That makes me sound like I'm 8,000 years old. But how to budget and how to spend or save money. How to cook, right? Things like that. That starts to happen the older we get. And then also other things like society says, okay, at 17 or 18, you can finally go see certain movies that we wouldn't let you see when you were 12. Many of you probably snuck into some of those movies. Some of you may still be scarred from movies that you snuck into that you were definitely too young to see, but you went to see anyway, okay? The difference is in more traditional cultures, there's a more formal process often of passing information from elders to the younger generations. But in our general society, a lot of it is quite informal. So, much like we talked about with puberty, that there's tremendous variations in how people go through these social transitions, we see that as well, or how people go through the biological transitions, we see that as well in social transitions. And when we think about variations in clarity, this comes back to that idea of how did you know when you were an adolescent? And how did you know when you were an adult? Right? And again, without formal rites of passage, it's a lot less clear to us at what point, because we stay in school now well into adulthood in some cases, right? Depending on what our responsibilities are, we know that there are 13, 14, and 15-year-olds who are having babies and raising them. Well, technically they're not an adult, but if you're raising a child at 14, I think you're pretty grown up, right? So it's really, there are certain things that are weird. A 14-year-old technically can't consent for their own medical procedures, but would consent for their child's medical procedures, which is fascinating in and of itself as well, right? So there's all sorts of weird things that happen without us having these more formal ceremonies and much clarity around when we become an adolescent and when we become an adult. Legally, that's even murky, right? So we know that 18, but we also know that sometimes when a youth commits a particularly heinous crime, they might be tried as an adult. There was just a case in Calgary recently where a 17-year-old is likely looking at being tried as an adult. So, but he's 17. He's not 18. He's not the legal age of majority yet. Doesn't matter in some cases. So we really lack this clarity. And so while adolescents in North America are considered adults at the age of 18, some adult privileges, for example, driving, come earlier and others later. So consuming alcohol in some provinces in all states. So again, Alberta at 18, you can drink, you can drive, you can buy pot, you can buy cigarettes, you can vote, you can run for public office. You are an adult. But not in Ontario, right? The rules are different. So that's one of those things that we need to think about. And then as I was mentioning, youth can also be tried as adults in the criminal justice system. So again, banking on, well, I'm under 18 isn't something to bank on, depending on what it is, what the alleged crime is. And then, as I said, in traditional cultures, there's often a more formal rite of passage or a marker of the transition. Sometimes the markers of the transition or the more formal rite of passage is not desirable. So there are still some countries and some cultures in which female genital mutilation is done. So when a female begins menstruating, she is subjected to genital mutilation that serves absolutely no purpose except to remove her ability to enjoy sexual intercourse. But that's a rite of passage. We also know of some cultures where circumcision is done as a rite of passage for adolescent males, but that is very, very rare. Most of the time, at least in North America, if circumcision is done, it's done while the boy is an infant, oftentimes within the first 2 weeks of life. So very, very different in terms of thinking about that as a rite of passage. Okay, so we'll keep that in mind. In terms of variations in continuity for social transitions, what we want to think about is whether the transition to adulthood is gradual or abrupt. And so we think about that in terms of continuous versus discontinuous transitions. And so a continuous transition is something that is gradual. And so in that sort of pre-industrial revolution period, it was a very continuous process. It was a very continuous transition because as the child got older and older, the responsibilities they were given grew until they reached adulthood. So if you were a young child, and I'm going to just use a female child as an example, you might first be given very small chores around the house to help out your mother. It could have been things like sweeping, right? So something that a 5 or 6 year old could do, maybe not very well, but again, could do. And then eventually, as you got older and older, would learn how to prepare meals, would learn how to wash dishes, would learn how to do laundry, would learn how to take care of younger siblings and possibly older relatives. For a male, again, as a child, would sort of go out with dad out to the farm and might not be able to do a whole lot, but would learn about how to plant crops, how to tell when they're good, how to weed them, how to know when you had to rotate fields, all that stuff. So when adulthood came, you already knew all the different things to do on the farm. So that's considered a continuous transition. What many of us experience is a discontinuous or abrupt transition. One of the things that has always just made me go, why do we do that, is when you're in high school, when you're in like grade 10, 11, and 12, we expect you to know what you want to do as your career, even though you've had zero experience potentially in the workforce or zero experience in the field that you're interested in. so that you can pick your courses wisely to make sure you have the right high school courses to get into the university program that's going to lead you to the career that you've chosen without having a clue as to what it is. What? Right? You graduate high school and you either go on to post-secondary or you get a job that you have had zero training for. Welcome to discontinuous transitions, right? Welcome to adulthood, where we expect you to know how to do stuff even though we haven't actually taught you. And we haven't really given you a chance to explore your options. I'm very much in favor of internships and shadowing and co-op programs and gap years, because I think before you settle in to post-secondary and possibly graduate or professional education, you need to know what you're going in for, right? So that's just me. But we typically have discontinuous transitions in North America today. And so this leads into this idea that there are significant differences in contemporary versus traditional cultures. Traditional cultures, we're going to see far more continuous transitions. In our contemporary culture, we see much more discontinuous transitions. Okay, so we've come to the highlight, which tells me that the answer to question 9 on your quiz for chapter 3 is D. So the answer to question 9 for the chapter 3 quiz is D, as in David, doorbell. Don't answer anything but D, okay? Okay. And transition into adulthood in contemporary society. So some of the factors that we need to consider are minority status and poverty. And these are the uncomfortable things to consider. They're the things we don't want to think about. They're the things that we want to pretend don't exist, but they do. And we have to address them. And we have to consider the impact that has on people. Discrimination makes it much harder to get experience. It makes it harder to not adhere to your group, your racial group, your cultural group, your social group. It makes it harder to get ahead, and it adds considerable stress. In the movie that you're going to watch for this chapter, we're going to see a lot of that, okay? And so it's just really hard. It's like a lot of people say things like, well, poor people just have to work harder to pull themselves out of poverty. Bullshit. Poor people work harder than most other people, but the conditions are set up to keep them in poverty, right? It is far more cost effective to buy staple food items at Costco. Far more cost effective. The problem is, you need to have extra money to buy a Costco membership. You need to have a vehicle to get to Costco to be able to buy things in bulk. You can't lug it home on the bus. And you have to have enough money up front to buy these larger amounts that will last you a lot longer and get you more bang for the buck. All 3 of those things are not available to people who live in poverty. And in fact, what also tends to not be available to people who live in poverty are actual supermarkets. In a lot of highly population-dense urban areas, we describe them as food deserts, where there aren't a lot of full supermarkets, but there are like convenience stores, or in New York City, what's known as bodegas, where, yeah, you can buy some produce at probably 3 to 10 times the price of what it would cost at Superstore. But again, when you factor in the bus and the time it would take you to get to Superstore and how you're going to bring everything home, you don't. So we have set up our communities, not deliberately, at least I'd like to believe not deliberately, for people who are down to stay down. And for people who have means to be able to increase their means. But we are not doing a good job of addressing the central issues that keep people in poverty. When the minimum wage was introduced, it was meant to be the minimum wage someone would need to earn to be able to buy a home, and assuming only one adult in the family was working. Minimum wage today, if you work full-time at minimum wage, you cannot afford to buy a house in Calgary. You can certainly not afford to have only one adult working. So the idea was good. How it's been rolled out is terrible, right? It's still better than if employers could just set their own wages, yes, but there are inherent problems in the way we do things. And until we figure out a way to fix those, until we take action to fix those, we're going to keep running into these problems where we need to consider things like minority status and poverty on a person's social development. Because if you're in a neighborhood, and this is some of what we're going to see in the movie, if you're in a neighborhood where the number one source of employment is working for a drug dealer, you're going to end up dealing drugs. And tell me how you're going to get ahead doing that. You're probably going to go to jail or get killed, right? So these are the bigger picture things we need to address. So, okay, I already talked a little bit about the impact of discrimination. The other things that we need to think about in terms of correlates of poverty are things like school failure, teen pregnancy, unemployment, and delinquency. Again, a teenager who gets pregnant oftentimes has to drop out of school, oftentimes cannot afford to raise their child on their own, so may have to turn to things that are less savory in order to make enough money. For all the groups, I'm going to go a tiny bit political for just a second, not really political, but just sort of ranty. The groups that like to call themselves pro-life, that are actually anti-choice groups, they are not pro-life. They are pro-fetus, and they promise that they will help women through their pregnancies, and then as soon as the women give birth, they drop them like hot potatoes. If those groups were truly pro-life, they would care about how this child would grow up, and they would continue supporting these teenage mothers by helping them finish their education, giving them job training, providing them with food and shelter. But they don't do that. They just say, you have to have your baby. You don't want to kill your baby, baby killer. And then the baby is born, and you know what? Diapers are expensive. Formula is expensive. People say, oh, breast milk is free. No, it's not. Do you know how much a mom has to eat to make enough breast milk to keep their child happy? And infants are typically only exclusively breastfed until about 6 months, and then they start eating food. And you know what happens when little kids start eating food? You make a fair amount of it to end up on the floor, the walls, the high chair, their clothes, their hair. They eat very little of it. So we have to address, excuse me, these bigger pictures, okay? And we can't pretend that they don't exist. Excuse me, what can be done to help ease the transition? Well, mentoring is one piece where we connect adolescents with other people who can provide them with some guidance, who can provide them with some help and some advice for how to make better choices, who can give them some experience, right, with jobs or with knowing what the options are. But we also need to have experiences, and we need to have support, which is often lacking. So that means we have to, again, go into communities, and we need to provide parents and their children the support that they need to be able to be lifted out of poverty. I don't think we frame it as an individual problem that people have to lift themselves up, but as a society, we have to work collectively to lift people out, okay? All right, so the influence of neighborhood conditions on adolescent development. This will definitely be highlighted in the movie you're going to be watching, which I will tell you about on the very next slide. But one of the things that we think about, we sort of think about these processes of neighborhood influences. And one of the big things is collective efficacy. And this is the extent to which community members trust each other, share common values, and count on each other to monitor the activity of youth in the community. This isn't so much about, like, do you have nosy neighbors? This is more about, is your community a community that cares about members of the community? Are there ample recreation options for children in the community? Is there ample supervision, right? Things like that. In neighborhoods with low collective efficacy, we see higher rates of delinquent youth. So where there aren't adults keeping an extra set of eyes on what's happening, when we live in very densely populated areas where there's too much going on for people to keep track of anything, we see more delinquent activity. That's a problem, right? We want neighborhoods. We want people to know their neighbors. We want, like, I love that I live in a neighborhood where people know my daughter. And I know that right now it's not an issue. We don't let her go to the park by herself. But I know as she gets older and she's going to be biking around the neighborhood with her friends or going to the park with her friends, I know people who will tell me if she's a little shit, right? Because they know who she is, they know who I am, and they're going to be like, hey, Carrie, you're not going to believe what she did today. And she'll know that I'll find out, and hopefully will prevent her from doing those sorts of things, okay? We've got good collective efficacy. But in neighborhoods that don't have that, it's easy for kids to get in trouble. And remember, adolescents are impulsive. They like taking risks. They like pushing limits. What are you going to do? Okay, the impact of stress. Poverty is incredibly stressful and has far-reaching consequences. So that's something else that we need to consider, that for people who live in poverty, again, we're not going to have recreation options. Our schools aren't going to have as much funding and aren't going to have enrichment programs and after-school programs and extra supervision. We're going to have situations where older siblings are responsible not just to watch younger siblings after school, but to make them dinner and help them with their homework and get them to bed, which comes at the expense of them doing their own homework and getting to bed. So we see a range of problems: access to healthcare, access to food, right? All of that, access to transportation. Poverty is stressful and exhausting, and it feels like you're constantly swimming against the tide to get out of it. And every time you feel like you make a little bit of progress, here comes another current to push you off course. And so I didn't look at my notes, limited access to resources in poorer neighborhoods. So I already said this: poorer healthcare, poorer schools, fewer recreational opportunities. This is what we need to work on changing as a society. So the movie for discussion. The movie that I want you to watch this week is called The Hate You Give. Some of you may have read the book, which, as always, the book is better than the movie, but the movie was pretty darn good as well. Watch it prior to completing the quiz for the chapter and prior to class. The movie is just over 2 hours in length, and it is emotionally heavy. Please don't leave it to the last minute. Please give yourself enough time to get through it. But it's amazing. I read the book. I watched the movie. I was moved by the movie like as much as I was by the book, even though the book was better. It's really, talk about figuring out who you are when you have a foot in two different worlds, and two very different worlds. The movie is available through Criterion On Demand, which is a streaming service we have through the library. This is the direct link that should take you to it. If the link does not work, just go to the MRU library website, search for The Hate You Give, and you will need to be logged into the MRU library in order to access it. So just keep that in mind. And then for your reflection, again, I have a feeling you won't have trouble writing 8 sentences about this movie, but in case you need something to get you going, Some things to consider would be, what are your thoughts about how Star handles being home Star versus school Star? While the movie is fiction, you can probably imagine the events happening in real life in the United States. What about in Canada? And which character in the movie did you associate with most?